Good evening, everybody. Our national security, the soundness of our dollar, the wealth we create for generations of Americans, the sovereignty of our nation, all at risk in the high-level trade talks now going on between the United States and China in Washington. And none of it, frankly, looks good for the good guys. From the talks come word that there are principled agreements, as they're called, principled agreements between the two delegations. No word on what has been agreed to, in principle or otherwise. There are also memoranda of understanding, 6 of those, and it hardly matters what they contain, because there's nothing binding, nothing enforceable in any memorandum of understanding at any time. And how do we know all of this? How can I report this to you tonight? Well, not because I've heard it from the U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, or any of his delegation, not because I've heard it from the White House Communications Director, Bill Shine. No, because our inside reporting relies entirely on the Chinese side. The Chinese Foreign Ministry is our correspondent, Edward Lawrence's principal source. Mom's the word of the day at the White House on these trade talks, leaving the field entirely to the Chinese. The White House seems content, for at least today, to allow China to control the messaging on trade, assisting only the powerful influence campaign of the globalist elites, the radical Dems, Rhino Republicans, Wall Street, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, and of course the Koch brothers, in their drumbeat of demands that President Trump do a trade deal, no matter how much it favors the Chinese, no matter how much pain it causes American workers and small businessmen and women. Do a deal, they say. Any deal. But this time, the art of the deal means President Trump either makes America great again, puts America and Americans first, or the Chinese prevail and dominate. All that stands between China and global domination is in fact one man, one president. While those talks go on in Washington, Chinese state-run tech giant Huawei is expanding its influence in North America, adding 200 employees in Canada, taking a primary position in building Germany's 5G network, offering emerging nations technology that is advanced and is much cheaper, no matter the security threat Huawei and China poses. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today warned nations about the existential threat posed by Huawei, its technology, and its Chinese communist masters.
We've been out around the world just making sure everybody had the same information, that countries understand the risk of putting this Huawei technology into their IT systems. We can't forget these systems were designed by with the express work alongside the Chinese PLA, their military in China. They are creating a real risk for these countries and their systems, the security of their people. Europeans care deeply about their privacy. The risk to privacy from this technology is very, very real.
We take it all up tonight. The Hudson Institute's Michael Pillsbury joins us. Retired 4-star General Jack Keane, former Reagan White House political director, Republican strategist and savant Ed Rollins, among our guests here tonight. Fired former FBI acting director Andrew McCabe's confessions are unending, and so too his constant contradictions. Former House Oversight Committee Chair Jason Chaffetz joins us here tonight to take those up and much more. We'll tell you about Empire actor Jussie Smollett, who's now in big trouble, as he should be. Today, he turned himself in to police in Chicago, where he faces a felony charge for filing a false police report. Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie Johnson slammed the media, Hollywood elites, and the liberal politicians who were so quick to believe, to stand behind his fraud and spread the evil of Smollett's lies and hoax.
This announcement today recognizes that Empire actor Jussie Smollett took advantage of the pain and anger of racism to promote his career. The accusations within this phony attack received national attention for weeks. Celebrities, news commentators, and even presidential candidates weighed in on something that was choreographed by an actor.
And so we begin. Our top story tonight. There has never been a more powerful influence campaign directed at any president of the United States than the one now underway on the issue of trade between America and China. The messaging is led by media, business, political elites, and most powerfully, the Chinese government itself. For now, at least, China has the loudest voice in our public arena. Edward Lawrence has been following the talks throughout today's trade session. He has the latest for us tonight from Washington. Ed?
Well, Lou, both the Chinese and U.S. trade delegations met at the U.S. Trade Representative's office to try and work out these agreements. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson says that they have an agreement on principle on major issues, some major issues. They would not say exactly what those issues were. A U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, says he wants specific enforcement actions written into these agreements. Reuters says there are 6 different agreements that tackle each specific concern by the United States. One major concern, the forced transfer of technology and protecting companies' intellectual property. Now, the U.S. delegation wants China to change the laws so they can't steal patent information going forward submitted by U.S. companies. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that this is one of the president's major issues.
This enormous transfer, this unlawful transfer of American wealth, American innovation and creativity that's taken place over the last decades is enormous. It's historic. The Trump administration is determined to push back against it.
Specific enforcement will be written into any memorandum of understanding, according to the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer. Still, China experts say that if the U.S. moves on the March 1st deadline without an agreement, then nothing will change.
Well, we've tried this approach before, taking a hard line. It hasn't worked. The problem is, when we talk to the Chinese, they think that we want to engage them. You have all sorts of expectations on their side. They need to see a new attitude on the part of Washington.
Both sides have said that President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping need to meet face-to-face in order to finally settle this agreement. The Chinese have blocked on their calendar March 26th through March 29th. Lou?
Ed, thank you very much. Ed Lawrence reporting. Joining us tonight is Dr. Michael Pillsbury. He's director of the Center for Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute, author, and trade advisor to the Trump administration, and it is great to have you with us. Michael, let's turn to what is going on. The Chinese today really have the field to themselves. The White House not talking, the Communications Department, the Trade Representative, and the Trade Ministry of China, with 30 members in the delegation outnumbering the U.S. Members better than 2 to 1. I mean, they really are dominating in every way right now, whether it's messaging or whether it is in the number of folks at the table.
Well, it's true, Lou. The Chinese are trying hard to control the narrative. But don't forget, even in their own press coverage, they think America has a secret weapon, and his name is Donald Trump. They often point out how many presidents they've been able to bamboozle, frankly, to use a polite word, over the last 30 years or more. They don't see Donald Trump the same way. They see him as a master negotiator. There's translations of his Art of the Deal, and they know he brought this to office. He first wrote about this in the year 2000.
You're making me feel, Michael, like we didn't have an election in 2016. I even voted for the man. So you needn't persuade me, and there are likely many.
I'm going to outpraise him.
Well, no, the praise is
but I'm telling you
worthy of it. But I think there are other issues we need to get to.
This is what the Chinese think. Important thing is this is what the Chinese think about him. So they're on the defensive.
They may be on the defensive, but right now we've got 2 members of the delegation. They are Steve Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow. Who are not exactly the most notorious fair traders. They do not grasp, it seems to me at least, from this comfortable distance I have from the nation's capital, the importance of deficits, their impact on our economy, and the necessity of prevailing. As a matter of fact, they seem both determined to take any deal, any way they can, despite some smooth, soothing words they utter from time to time to the left-wing media. Your thoughts?
My thought is that Larry and Steve have a different worldview than the president, but the president is capable of hearing their point of view, welcoming the fundraising skills of Steve Mnuchin. He was a major fundraiser during the campaign, but he can understand the difference.
A different matter, but all right.
I did enjoy Peter Navarro talking about the stench of Goldman Sachs in Peter's speech in November.
And unregistered foreign agents.
That too.
We could name names, couldn't we?
But let's give the president some credit. He wants a debate
Well,
to
now,
take
wait a minute.
place in front of him.
One minute you want to praise him, and then you find him in deficit for credit. He's never either on this broadcast, never short of praise,
I think the Chinese see him as tariff man. They've translated that into China and into their press. Tariff man. They're afraid he's going to put the tariffs back on.
I understand the importance of understanding the enemy. I also understand the importance of disregarding Sinocentrism, if you will.
Right.
Just because they happen to be at the table doesn't, to me, in any way garnish the serving. We are talking about this nation reversing decades. This president is the only one. Think about this. The only one leading any Western nation who has stood up against the Chinese and said, in the deficits, in the external debt that is rising uncontrollably,
the theft,
and stop the intellectual property and technology theft that you seem to think is a birthright that is that of the PLA. I mean, it's madness. And then the United States turns to China and says, as part of a trade deal, we're going to ask you not to steal from us. A bank doesn't say don't steal from us. They put up armed guards. They put up ways in which to stop you if you wish to rob them. They don't say, please sign this, dear bank robber, that you won't try again. This is madness, is it not?
I think we can place a bet of $1,000, Lou, between you and me. Mm-hmm. I think the president's going to insist on an enforcement mechanism. This is not going to be the end of the story. The China theft story and the trade lack of reciprocity.
It's not going to be the end of the story?
It's going to go on for our lifetimes, Lou. But the president's going to he's going to score some points in these talks.
But he can't rip the whole thing up. You are the Chinese expert. So, but
you are too. I hereby appoint you a China expert too.
I wish it were so easy as to be anointed, appointed, etc.
I'll teach you some more Mandarin.
But I'm more interested in plain-spoken English, and I am more interested in no more long war doctrine, as we heard when it came to counterinsurgency and fighting the war on terror.
Yes.
I'm no more interested in that than, for example, saying that this is going to be a generational war. If it's a generational war, we lose, and you know that, because of the sheer weight of the Chinese state.
It's a 100-year marathon.
Yes, it's a 100-year marathon, and it's a title for a book I think we ought to think about. But here's
70 years
fact.
Are already
the fact is we don't have 100 years. We have now. And the threat is extant, and it's existential. And we need to respond to it. This president is doing so. I worry, and worry deeply, that he does not have a sufficient voice amongst those who are there to serve him and the nation. They have shortcuts and other interests that they seem to find preeminent rather than that of the president's values and policies.
If you go back and read the president's book in the year 2000, you'll find he already identifies China as the main challenge to the future of the United States.
You and I are having trouble communicating. And I think one of the reasons is you seem to think you need to defend the president. I think we need to defend the reality and the threats and the issues that are on the table. And the issues on the table are memoranda of understanding. And you and
Yes.
I both know that in any business, in any walk of life, and in politics or government, that an MOU isn't worth the paper it's written on. It's unenforceable. It's certainly not binding in any fashion. We know that we have to stop theft. Hundreds of billions of dollars in theft. There has to be not just a discussion about vis-a-vis the Chinese. It has to be, what in hell will we do to protect our cyberspace? What will we do to protect our cyber assets? And that, by the way, includes our intellectual property as well as technology.
Yes.
What is the answer to those questions?
Well, the answer is the framework is much broader than U.S.-China trade talks. I think the president's got a more comprehensive strategy in mind. Sometimes he calls it the Indo-Pacific strategy. There's a cyber offensive component to it. It's really across the board competition.
No danger
with China.
then no danger then that anything will be signed or come of these sham talks that are going on right now in Washington, D.C.
No, I didn't say that.
That's what I was asking, though.
I think the Chinese want to control the narrative.
Yeah.
They're up against the toughest
They want to
president
control
in
the damn
history.
world.
That's the book called 100-Year Marathon. They're on the way to doing
I
it.
stepped right into that. We have to conclude. Always good to talk with you, Michael.
I love your books, Lou.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Michael Pillsbury. We recommend his book to you highly. 100 years. 100 years. We're going to shorten that.
70 years gone already.
There you go. Still
Thanks.
ahead tonight. Good to have you with us. The left-wing national media's complicity in Jussie Smollett's fake hate crime and how it exposes their not-so-subtle liberal bias. Ooh.
If there are any independent voices out there, if there are any journalists who are not beating the same drum and giving the same talking points, then we pay the price.
The left pays the price. But so far, it's an orthodoxy that seems intent on surviving. Drat the luck. We'll have more on that later. Jason Chaffetz joins us. Up next, Speaker Pelosi. Well, she's rounding up her band of radical Dems trying to dismantle the president's national emergency. And by the way, she wouldn't mind dismantling the entire Trump agenda. Ed Rollins with me right after the break. Oh, yes, and it's about 2020 already. Stay with us. We'll be right back. One of our favorite people here, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, encouraging members of her Congress to support a resolution that would block President Trump's national emergency declaration. Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas will introduce the resolution, we're told, reliably tomorrow. So far, just 200 members have signed on as co-sponsors. I'm starting to think there's a partisan divide here, aren't you? Well, no Republicans so far are supporting the legislation, but Rhino Senator Susan Collins, bless her heart, she says she will if it were a clean resolution when it reaches the Senate. Now, there's a tough bargain. Senator Collins arguing there are times an emergency declaration makes sense, but this isn't one of them. She didn't exactly explain what that meant. When would you have a declaration of national emergency other than when there is, for example, a national emergency? The good senator says the president should instead work with Congress. You know what a fun thing that's going to be. The same Congress that's made up of mostly Democrats and have just passed a resolution to deny him his declaration. So, Senator, I think you need to work on the logic just a little bit and maybe expand the fact base. Certainly think about please securing the border, Senator. And of course, Maine among the top states, Senator from Maine, top 10 states for opioid-related overdose deaths. Maine also with a crime rate of over 16 offenses for every 1,000 people. By the way, I might remind the senator that it is this president who declared opiates to be a national emergency in his campaign from almost the very first day. Well, despite the ever-growing field of 2020 Democratic hopefuls, a lot of hope, a lot of Democrats, the odds makers are heavily favoring President Trump to win re-election. President Trump is the 3-2 odds-on favorite. Kamala Harris is the leading Democrat at 8-1. That is what we call a big lead. Joining us tonight, former Reagan White House political director, Fox Business political analyst, Ed Rollins, a man who knows something about political odds, and the odds makers say.
But there's a whole lot of tread has to go down off this truck before we get to the.
You're not going to tell me it's early days, are you? You're not going to throw that one at me, too.
I'm not going to tell you it's early days. It was just one person, but when you got 24 candidates out there running, we're going to be so tired of this election by the time it comes. In the meantime, the president's got all kinds of stuff he has to do and do well, including this trade deal we're just talking about here, which is critical.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people right now are not paying attention to the fact this president is focused on 2020.
Right.
He always has to be focused on the United States, our national interests as president of this country, and he's done so better than any president in modern history. But this is about 2020 now, and he's got to prevail in these trade talks. Absolutely. The United States must prevail.
Absolutely.
He has to prevail on every single issue. The border wall, he has to prevail. He has to secure that border. The list goes on. And right now, at risk is the economy itself. And he's got this huge influence campaign run at him directly on the Chinese trade talks, trying to convince him and the American people that the outcome of the trade talks are all about assuring global market stability and price appreciation. It's pure nonsense.
There's two things that got him elected. One is he was viewed as a stronger leader than obviously Hillary, and he was. But secondly is that he basically had the strength and the convictions to move forward his agenda. And that's what we're dealing with right now.
Just to deal with the issue of these consecutive, and we're talking almost a half century of trade deficits and budget deficits in this country with an interregnum of 4 years.
People understand what trade deficits mean. What they do understand is when jobs basically get put us overseas and what have you. And this is a make or break deal. My sense today is we have to win this one. You're going to have to fight the Chinese all the way to make them live up to it.
You're not going to have to fight the Chinese. You're going to have to fight Mnuchin.
Right.
You're going to have to fight Kudlow, the Koch brothers. I mean, the list goes on.
I promise you, every one of the Chinese delegation that's here is exactly on the plan, on the page that they want. They know what they want. We're still basically arguing what we want. The president knows what he wants, but he's got to make sure his team knows the outcome is critical.
Your thoughts right now as we head into this new week coming up, a lot going on, whether it's Vietnam and North Korea and Kim Jong-un's summit.
There's so much on this agenda from the ones you just mentioned right there, which normally would take a whole month getting prepared for and talking about. This president never gets a break, never gets a breather, and he's just got to basically get his team together and move the ball forward.
And the great thing is, he never slows. He never slows. He never even pauses. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ed Rollins, up next, a decision made on how to handle an undecided House race in North Carolina just because they cheated. Isn't that the way it works? They cheated fair and square, right? Well, we'll tell you how they dealt with it in North Carolina the right way. More on the border crisis with Trump 2020 Communications Director Mark Lauder. He's coming up here next, but before we go, part of what the president has to deal with. Look at the national debt, $22 trillion. We're coming right back. Stay with us. As we're entering the 2020 presidential campaign season, we're basically already here, we all know one thing. All Democrats want, more than anything, to defeat President Trump. But after that, things get a little murky. Tonight, correspondent Peter Ducey tells us what he's hearing from Democrats in early voting states about what they want in the eventual nominee.
Mayor, it's so great to be in your city.
Democrats trying to woo early state voters are hearing that when it comes to beating Donald Trump,
We're desperate.
but the things that consume Capitol Hill,
Roger Stone, Mr. Manafort, Mueller report,
hello everybody, are missing on the campaign trail because none of those names were prominent at events in early states in the last week. Potential Democratic primary goers there are much more passionate about things like health care.
What are you going to do for a small business, which both sides agree on is the backbone of America, to offer quality health care to all Americans?
I recently fractured and dislocated my shoulder, but the problem is I'm going to have to pay for it out of pocket.
Having just reached the age of 65, I thought I was going to be like not paying so much for my drugs. Oh my God.
In South Carolina, climate change is seen as a unique threat.
I think our state is very vulnerable with the rising seas, flooding.
And in New Hampshire, there was a plea for labor protections.
What you are doing now as a senator and what you will do as president to level the playing field for unions.
Nobody seemed too concerned about bankrolling ambitious progressive platforms except in Columbia, South Carolina, where one man had a question for Kamala Harris.
I support Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. Simultaneously, we have a $22 trillion national debt and a $1.2 trillion deficit. How do you square that circle?
But ultimately, people want presidential hopefuls to explain what they can do for them, like this educator in Manchester.
Why don't I get paid more? Because I come home with my head dragging off the floor and crying at night for these kids, and I get paid minimum wage.
So even though everything in the political universe seems to revolve around President Trump, Democratic candidates I've seen aren't hearing a ton of specific complaints about him. They're hearing more questions about what Democrats could possibly offer to improve their lives at work or at home. Right?
Substance.
Peter, thank you. Tonight we continue our week-long look at the Green New Deal, championed by self-described Democratic Socialist Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This evening we look at what would seem to many to be the heart of the matter, climate change. Correspondent Doug McElway examines how the plan deals with one of the most controversial topics and the possible solutions tied to it in all of politics.
There is no fixing our economy without addressing the racial wealth gap.
For diehard skeptics of climate change, the rollout of the Green New Deal with its wealth redistribution and restructuring of the economy was a tip-off to an unspoken agenda.
We always knew climate was a stalking horse for socialism, communism, totalitarianism, whatever you want to call it.
But even many Democrats who support a climate change agenda saw the rollout as absurd.
I've read it, and I've reread it, and I asked Ed Markey, what in the heck is this?
If you just add up the promises there, it's clear it's unaffordable, and it's clear it's unrealistic.
Some hope that from the excesses of the Green New Deal, more moderate voices emerge.
The climate debate has been driven for years by the edges of each party.
Grumet points to the chair and ranking member of the Senate Energy Committee, both from poor fossil fuel states, both pushing for promising technologies, carbon capture and storage.
Till responsible people like Senators Murkowski and Manchin and the Energy Committee start to really enforce against the edges, we will continue to yell at each other.
Others question whether there's any urgency at all, that the so-called 97% consensus of climate scientists is meaningless. Climatologist John Christie notes that the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history have broken with consensus.
I take a real hard look at climate model output and can demonstrate that these models are just too sensitive to carbon dioxide and that the real world is not spiraling off into some dangerous territory of climate.
Novelist Michael Crichton once suggested another solution. He looked back to the turn of the last century, when people, quote, didn't know what a radio was, or an airport, or a movie, or a television, or a computer, or a cell phone, or a jet, an antibiotic, a rocket, a satellite, an MRI, ICU, IUD, or what IBM was. He went on, and then ended with, now you tell me who can predict the world of 2100. His point was that models only carry the present into the future, and that the creative genius of individuals who bettered life in the past will do the same in the future. Brett?
Doug, thanks. Tomorrow night we conclude our series on the Green New Deal with a look at its primary sponsor and her role in the Democratic Party. The rush to judgment in the Jussie Smollett case, we'll discuss it all with the panel when we come back.
Today recognizes that Empire actor Jussie Smollett took advantage of the pain and anger of racism to promote his career. My concern is that hate crimes will now publicly be met with a level of skepticism that previously didn't happen.
How can you doubt that? How do you not believe that? It's the truth. And then it became a thing of it's not necessarily that you don't believe that this is the truth. You don't even want to see the truth.
To be quite honest, it's shameful.
An angry Chicago police superintendent today laying out the case that they have against Jussie Smollett, who is now charged with falsifying this alleged hate crime, planning a bogus hate crime, including mailing a letter to himself, as the assistant state attorney laid out in intricate detail. Now, when this first happened, and his explanation for it, everyone seemed to weigh in, including presidential candidates. Cory Booker and Kamala Harris both called it a modern-day lynching in tweets. Just moments ago, Senator Harris released a statement about this after being asked repeatedly on the trail about it. Like most of you, I've seen the reports about Jussie Smollett, and I'm sad, frustrated, and disappointed. When anyone makes false claims to police, it not only diverts resources away from serious investigations, but it makes it more difficult for other victims of crime to come forward. At the same time, we must speak the truth. Hate crimes are on the rise in America. Part of the tragedy of this situation is that it distracts from that truth and has been seized by some who would like to dismiss and downplay the very real problems that we must address. We should not allow that. I will always condemn racism and homophobia. We must always confront hate directly, and we must always seek justice. Kamala Harris there from the trail. Let's bring in our panel. Matthew Continetti, editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, national security analyst Morgan Ortegas, and Jonathan Swan, national political reporter for Axios. Pretty well worded Jonathan, in that response, but a sticky issue for these candidates who obviously went down the road when this first came out.
Right. The first statement was, passionate and righteous, and she was asked about it. There was a piece of video where she was asked about it, and sort of had this strange moment where she turned to her staff looking quite irritated, and then turned back and clearly thought more about it and put out this statement. There have been other politicians. I think Nancy Pelosi deleted her tweet initially where she condemned this. So there was a whole lot of people who initially condemned this who are now in various ways trying to quietly walk it back.
Morgan, the police superintendent in Chicago, I think a lot of people were riveted by Eddie Johnson. Here's another piece of it.
How can an individual who's been embraced by the city of Chicago turn around and slap everyone in this city in the face? To make things worse, the accusations within this phony attack received national attention for weeks. When you get the opportunity, the shooting victims and families in this city that are victims of those crimes, give them the same amount of attention.
Morgan.
Yeah, I thought the police chief did an excellent job there, but what he did leave out of that press conference was the political element to this, and that's why this has gotten more coverage than all of the tragic murders that the police chief spoke about, and so I did think it was a missed opportunity to talk about that. One thing that we have learned is that Jussie Smollett is a great actor. I've watched him on Empire, but he's a terrible writer. When we see what he staged, not only in this attack, but in the letter, and of course the resources that were diverted. One thing I would say, just going back to Kamala Harris, one thing to remember is there are plenty of people who voted for President Trump in 2016 that also voted for Barack Obama. So I think while it might not help her in a primary, it's important to remember those voters and to keep those voters in the back of her mind, and to remember that those people could still potentially be winnable. And whenever she addresses it fairly and shows that she's not biased to everyone that is supportive of Trump, there may be an opening there.
The president did not stay out of this. There was some said they thought he might, but he did not. At Jussie Smollett, what about MAGA and the tens of millions of people you insulted with your racist and dangerous comments? Hashtag Make America Great Again. Notably, he didn't tweet about the Coast Guard officer who was arrested by the FBI and his background of planning white nationalist killings. But your thoughts in the big picture here, Matthew, as we look at kind of where we are in this culture moment.
We're nowhere good. Like the same people who rushed to embrace Smollett's faux story were the people who rushed to criticize the Covington Catholic boys when that snippet of viral video came out from the pro-life movement march in D.C. And what is the connective tissue, right? It's a willingness to believe the worst of Donald Trump and his supporters. And that's why people rushed to back Smollett. That's why they rushed to condemn the Covington Catholic boys. And now Republicans sometimes are always eager to embrace the worst critiques of Democrats, but we see time and time again that the mainstream media amplifies the liberal critique of Republicans to a far greater extent than it does the conservative critique of Democrats. And this willingness to believe narratives, no matter their truth, is very dangerous to democracy, which depends, Brett, as we know, on evidence and patience.
You've seen the president and how he deals with Twitter, and obviously he saw this moment as a political, hey, this is the point. My supporters are getting blamed for everything.
To his defense, it wasn't Trump who inserted himself in this moment. It was Jussie Smollett. He's the one who said that the people were walking around Chicago saying, this is MAGA country, lynching people, etc. So, this was not something that Trump inserted himself in. He was explicitly inserted in the story by the hoaxer. So I will give Trump some defense there.
There you go. Next up, should the Alabama woman who joined ISIS be allowed to come back into the U.S.?
We would see dead bodies in public. We would see kids seeing dead bodies in public. We would see limbs splattered on the floor. And seeing it with your own eyes really made you wake up and change.
She
she's a terrorist. She's not coming back. She's not a U.S. citizen. She is not entitled to U.S. citizenship, and she's not coming back to our country to pose a threat.
She's willing to pay whatever debts she has to society. She's even willing to spend years behind bars if that's the debt she owes. And she wants to speak out to ensure that other young women are not brainwashed and manipulated into committing the same horrible mistakes that she's done.
If she did believe in the citizenship oath, she abandoned it and actually violated it and became an enemy combatant.
There are actually two cases, one here in the U.S. with this woman from Alabama, Hoda Muthana, and the other woman from the UK, and the UK is saying you can't come back either, Shamima Begum, both of them tied to ISIS, leaving their homeland to go to ISIS, to be with ISIS fighters, and to post online urging ISIS to attack Americans and Europeans. The president tweeting, the United States is asking Britain, France, Germany, and other European allies to take back over 800 ISIS fighters that we captured in Syria and put them on trial. The caliphate is ready to fall. The alternative is not a good one, and that we will be forced to release them. Yesterday, tweeting, I have instructed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and he fully agrees, not to allow Hoda Muthana back into the country, specifically on this case. Morgan, thoughts?
I think it speaks volumes that she'd rather rot in an American jail than eat grass in these ISIS camps. So that is a masterful defeat of the caliphate, at least from a PR perspective. We've got a couple of issues going on here. We've got the factual and legal basis of was she ever an American citizen or not? Was she born on the diplomatic blue list when her father was at the UN? So that's one issue that clearly the State Department will have to deal with from a legal perspective. The other issue is, of course, is what do we do with enemy combatants in general? And this is still, 17 years, 18 years after 9/11, we're still dealing with this. The Europeans, of course, hate Gitmo, but at the same time, they don't have a real process for enemy combatants. They're trying to try them as criminals. So I think what we likely need here, and some senators have talked about this, is perhaps some sort of international regime to try these enemy combatants, because we can't take all of these people and put them in Gitmo, and no one clearly wants them in their country. So we're going to have to come up with another legal mechanism to deal with these fighters.
It's a big issue, Matthew.
We have room in Gitmo, and if she's not an American citizen, that's where she should go. If she's a citizen, we can indict her. That's what Andy McCarthy recommends, and I agree with him. So the choice is relatively simple. I feel like we're looking through the wrong end of the telescope here. Why are we feeling any sympathy for this woman when ISIS is a genocidal former regime, thank goodness, that murdered women, murdered children, devastated Christians and other religious minorities? So the choice is a simple one. Citizen, indict. Non-citizen, Gitmo.
Well, I think Secretary of State Pompeo was pretty clear. I mean, he's pretty cut and dry.
Well, I don't think he was clear enough, because I would like to hear from them their rationale for why she's not a citizen. So I've heard the birthright argument, but she got a passport, and there is some debate about whether he was a diplomat or because he ended his diplomatic service, and that's
before.
Sure, but she got a passport. So then the other part of it is you join a foreign arm. They're not a state. It's a terrorist organization. She pretty clearly, in my estimation, committed treason, which is one of the ways you lose your citizenship. But then again, you'd have to go through a court process. So I just want to hear them clearly state their case for why she's not a citizen, why she can't come into the country. Because if she is a citizen, the law's the law. You have to go through the process.
What do we think happens if these foreign countries don't take these fighters back? What happens to these, 800 plus that are in northeastern Syria?
This is why we have to come up with some sort of legal resolution with the Europeans. It makes no sense that we would take an American citizen like Anwar al-Awlaki and kill him via a drone strike, kill his son 2 weeks later via a drone strike during the Obama administration. So you can kill American citizens without due process in the middle of a war zone, but you don't have a legal mechanism for what to do with them. So this is one of those instances in which the Europeans really like to push stuff under the rug. And as we get near the end of this war in Syria, we're going to have to deal with it.
Ted Cruz had a bill, the Expatriate Terrorist Act, that he submitted in a previous Congress that would strip them of citizenship as soon as they leave for enemy territory. He should resubmit that bill, and Congress should pass it and the President sign it.
Is there a sense inside the White House that the Syria part is coming to an end, that this president is going to get those troops back?
Well, Trump wants to. There's been rearguard action from people like Lindsey Graham trying to get him to commit to some kind of skeletal US presence there in a stabilization force or something in a buffer zone. There's also another zone where they're wanting to keep people more long term. Trump wants them out. So I think it's going to happen. I don't think there's going to be a long-term substantial presence there under the Trump administration. But, there's a lot of wiggle room there and TBD.
And the request that maybe other European countries fill the void of U.S. troops coming out didn't seem like it was met with a lot of happiness over in Germany.
Yeah, I was there at the Munich Security Conference. I think that there was a lot of issues, namely Merkel giving her probably final speech and quite angry at the administration over a few things. But, saying that, from a political perspective, I'd love to know, what do the 2020 Democrat candidates think about this? What do they want to do with these fighters? Do they want to send them to Gitmo? This is the real world stuff that these guys need to start answering. And I think, we don't want this stuff to be political, but it is. And if the president is forcing 2020 Democrats to, defend these actions or defend what to do with these terrorists, it's just a winner for him every day.
Panel, thank you. When we come back, a little forecast to Vietnam.